Welcome again, everyone. Thank you to the shop. Thank you to the Curb, our partners. I have a confession to make. I love tea. I drink Chinese tea. I kind of think I'm a nerd like these guys, but when it comes to tea. However, a few years ago, I was somewhat convinced by the man right here, Mr. Abdul-Rehman Malik, that coffee had some potential. Before that, I was the kind of coffee drinker that would drink it at college get-togethers, and then afterwards at my local coffee shop, a bit hipster about it, a bit wanting different flavors. What's the most recent charcoal latte and all these other things. And then I found that I didn't like the taste of coffee, really. I was just doing it for the social experience, and I was doing it for all the other things that came with it. But Abdul-Rehman really convinced me, one, that coffee could be this great drink on its own, and two, that maybe we had a little bit more to do with coffee, right? And that it's maybe the colonial past of the tea was a bit different than the history of coffee. And so I started drinking coffee more regularly. I started enjoying my pour-overs. But I was still a little skeptical until he actually brought me a bag of coffee from Indonesia, which was very recent, actually. And he was like, "Do you have a grinder at home?" And I was like, "No, I don't." And he's like, "Well, just take it to your local coffee shop." And I felt kind of bad about doing that because I didn't want to fake the funk. So I was like, let me just get a grinder. And let me get a manual grinder. And let me get something that I can make pour-over coffee at home. And ever since I've done that, my life has kind of changed a little bit. And I can now raise my hand like all of you when you ask if you drank a cup or two of coffee. And I really appreciate the nuances in coffee just as much as I do tea, or maybe just a little bit less. So Abdul-Rehman Malik has been my introduction to coffee in a way that I couldn't have imagined before. And in that way, I've also been introduced to Mokhtar Alkhanshali, who's here from Port of Mokha, and is an incredible, young, energetic coffee, not only connoisseur, producer, but innovator. He's the subject of the latest book by Dave Eggers, Monk of Mokha, and I'm really inspired by both of them. You know, somebody who can kind of tell the story, and someone who is the living story and the continuation of a tradition and history of coffee. So we're really blessed to have them both here with us and to talk to us about the Muhammadan bean, the secret history of Islam and coffee. Perhaps something that won't be so much of a secret after this. Thank you. Welcome. Over to you guys.
Thank you. Aloha, everyone. And just before we dive right in, I just want to say thank you to the shop, to Conrad, to Asa, to the incredible team at Shangri, who's made both of us feel so incredibly welcome, and our families and our friends who've come and joined us from the mainland as well, and all of you. I also want to footnote before I begin by saying that today is actually a particularly special day because it's the first time that Mokhtar and I have been able to present this together, and it's something that we've been talking about literally for years. And Mokhtar had reached out to me. I had heard about him, and I'd heard about his incredible story, and we had so many friends in common, but we hadn't actually connected. And then I had heard from friends that he had heard some of my presentations on the topic, and he approved, which put my heart at ease. And then over the last few years, we've been talking and following his incredible journey. And I hope each and every one of you, shameless plug, will buy a copy of Monk of Mokha, buy an extra one for friends. It's one of those remarkable stories and books, and I'm sure at the end of this hour, you'll have a sense of what really makes Mokhtar a remarkable human being, and what makes this book really not just a literary event, but actually, I think, a cultural milestone in the intersection between food, politics, coffee, Islam, Muslimness, and culture. And I think we can say that about very, very few things. This is kind of our living room today. This is kind of our front room, and we're going to be brewing coffee. Our friends at the Curb are brewing coffee, and Mokhtar is going to be brewing coffee. And I'm gonna bring Mokhtar in on the conversation in a second, but I want to take you back for a moment, not to an exotic place, or maybe for some of you an exotic place. I want to take you back to almost the typical suburbs of any major metropolitan city in the United States or Canada. Growing up outside of Toronto, Canada, my parents from the subcontinent were tea drinkers. Not only were they tea drinkers, tea was the thing that punctuated the moments of their life. In the morning, there was chai at breakfast. There was chai sometime in the afternoon. There was chai in the evening. In fact, we used to time the ending of dinner by ensuring that the kettle was boiling as we were cleaning up the plates, because very little time should pass between the conclusion of the meal and the serving of the chai. My parents are a bit older now, but even today when I visit my home in suburban Toronto, 2, 3 in the morning, even before the morning prayer times, I'll hear the kettle boiling downstairs and my father mixing Earl Grey with Indian tea with Assam, creating some sort of witch's brew of chai, and then adding the milk, and my parents drinking late at night, and kind of coming downstairs bleary eyed. I said, "What are you doing?" "Oh, we're having chai, join us." Tea was something we drank at home. It was about punctuating the day at home. But coffee, coffee we never drank at home, ever. Coffee was drunk at Mr. Donut. On Sundays, my parents would take me and my siblings to the mosque. Sunday might not be the holy day for Muslims as Friday is, but it was our holy day. It was the day we were off from school. We'd go to Sunday school at the mosque. And on the way back from our trip to the mosque, we'd stop near Dundas and Kafra, just off the Highway 427, and we'd stop at his famed Mr. Donut. And we'd go in and we'd have French crullers, and we'd have their coffee. Now, I can't comment on the quality of their coffee now, but I can comment on the smell. Walking into Mr. Donut was to be embraced by this rich smell of brewed coffee. Maybe now I think of it as slightly burnt, but it was woody. It was wholesome, it was embracing. And you know what I loved about those Sundays? We'd sit in the coffee shop and we'd talk. Coffee was about talking, about sitting down, enjoying a cup together, having a donut, experiencing a little bit of time away from the day-to-day. Coffee was a social experience. Tea was a home experience, but coffee was a social. We went out for coffee. Now that stayed with me all my life, and I probably was when I was in high school. I came across an article, and maybe Mokhtar, you've seen the same article at some point. But I saw this article in our home library, and it was a small little pamphlet, and it said, "Coffee, the wine of Islam." I was like, "Oh, this is interesting. Let's read it." So I read this, and this almost fantastical story starts to emerge of Sufi saints and sultans and fatwas and wars and sieges, of it being the devil's cup and the devil's brew, and it being something that brought you closer to God. And I honestly looked at it and I thought, typical Muslim propaganda. We want to control everything. Coffee didn't come. What do we have to do with coffee? It's Juan Valdez. That's where coffee came from.
Just one note for those drinking coffee. I always tell people to drink it slow. As it cools, when coffee cools, the temperature cools down, and you start to taste more flavors. I always say when it cools, it rules. So just drink it slow. And this is gonna be a poor cooking show, so don't mind me grinding.
So as I read this, I was kind of like, I kind of actually set it aside. I'm not sure about the veracity of this. It wasn't until Starbucks opened just outside the University of Toronto that I think my interest in coffee was reignited. All of a sudden there was these exotic coffees from Papua New Guinea. There was exotic coffees from Sulawesi and Sumatra. There were coffees from Africa, from Ethiopia, and from Rwanda eventually. I was like, oh, this is interesting. So I decided to go down the rabbit hole. And I decided to begin to look through the libraries of the University of Toronto for books about coffee, old manuals of cookery, and books about the history of food. And a story started to emerge which was very similar to the story I'd read in that pamphlet, Coffee, the Wine of Islam. And for the last 20, 25 years, I have found myself returning again and again to the exploration of the Muhammadan being, of the way in which coffee was shaped, in a way its secret was discovered, and in a way its craft was perfected in the worlds that we now term Muslim and the civilizations that we now call Islamic. I don't know, Mokhtar, if you remember the first time, and maybe you grew up with it, but I remember being befriending scholars from the Yemen, from the valley of Hadramaut, in a place near the city of Tarim. And I remember it was probably in the holy city of Medina, the city of where the Prophet Muhammad is buried, in the late 90s, that I was introduced to this prayer. And in my discussions of coffee with some of the scholars from the Yemen and the holy city of Medina, I kind of shared my own discoveries about coffee, thinking that I had discovered something pretty groundbreaking and magnificent. And they just smiled at me. They smiled at me knowingly and tenderly and lovingly. And they shared with me this prayer. It's the short prayer. It's the short prayer that one recites before one drinks coffee. And it is a prayer which is a prayer that is ubiquitous in the Yemen. That when coffee is imbibed, and it's always imbibed in good company, that this prayer is said, and then the opening of chapter of the Quran is read. And then coffee is taken in, and coffee is enjoyed. And the prayer celebrates what it says, the Mashayikh al-Kahwa al-Bunniya. It celebrates the scholars, the saints of coffee, the saints of brown coffee, the coffee brewed from the bean. And then it invokes the saints of the past, and it invokes the family of the Prophet, and invokes the men and women who produced the coffee, and it invokes the friends of God. And it asks God to relieve oneself of difficulty, of sickness, of debt. It asks God to relieve oneself of troublesome worries. It asks God to bless those who brewed the coffee, who brewed the coffee, who picked the coffee, and then we say the prayer, and then we drink the coffee. For me, this was kind of a mind-blowing moment. That this was not merely something you drank. This was something you imbibed into your very soul. What was it about coffee, and what was it about faith, and what was it about spirituality where all of this met? And what was it that the coffee drinker truly wants? Mokhtar and I love this term. It's a term that's invented, I would say, is actually, wouldn't you say it's invented just for coffee itself? I've never seen the word used elsewhere.
Well, the word marqaha, for those who don't know coffee, it's an Arabic word, qahwa, right? And so it means wine in Arabic. And it's a particular type of wine in Arabic, al-khamr alladhi yuthiru nashwa, the wine that raises you to a state of ecstasy. So the word qaha, it also means satiates. And so the word marqaha, it has that root word in qaha, which I don't know if you knew that, but and actually I really like your translation of the word marqaha. So I would like them to know that's not part of that.
Marqaha is that feeling. Is the feeling of kind of spiritual elation and sprightliness of spirit, and a state of kind of total mental and spiritual well-being that one gets from imbibing a perfect cup of coffee. You know, in barista culture, they talk about the God shot, don't they? and I mean, you're a pro.
Aspire and pro.
What would you say? Like, how would you describe the God shot?
I mean, the thing about coffee is that there's like the science of it, the extraction, how much you want the extraction rate to be, 18, 22%. But it's every barista, all they're trying to do is after the coffee farmer, after he or she picks that cherry from the tree, there's nothing we can do to make it better. We're just trying to not mess it up. And so the God shot, this idea of like how to keep the legacy of the farm and how to help this cup reach its full potential. And there's so many things at play. There's chemistry, there's, with roasting, there's water and the TDS of the water and the grind set, all these things to get this perfect shot.
That releases what I would say the seed and the unseen qualities of the bean. And I think for my wife Farina is here, I think we remember the first time we had a God shot. And I remember it was on Hackney Road in East London.
An espresso?
It was, and it was outside. it was outside a coffee shop. It was sadly closed down. It was called A Taste of Bitter Love. What a beautiful name! And it was a husband and wife team from Australia and Greece who ran it. And it was a beautiful day. It was before we'd had our son Abdi, and we were enjoying kind of the afternoon. And the barista brought over 2 cups of espresso. He said, guys, I've been playing with this. I want you guys just to try it. It's on the house. And Farina's an erstwhile coffee drinker. She's like us. She's had to come into it. By living with me, she's had no choice, sadly. But I would say that you had it first, and you were quiet, weren't you? What was that feeling?
I can't believe I haven't been introduced to this before.
Yeah. And then I had it, and we were just quiet. And I would say that's the closest I got to the God shot. Where literally you drink something, and you're transported, and silence is the only response, because the flavor is just continue to give, and you just feel. Markaha, it's a spiritual experience. And I think in terms of spirituality, and Mukhtar is going to help guide us through this, is to really think about the origins of coffee. Now we know that in terms of vegetal genetics, in terms of understanding the place where coffee came from, I would say, if I was using spiritual language, that when the divine plan was unfolding around us, it was somehow decided in the high heavens that coffee would only come from one place in the world, and that was Ethiopia.
There's always this huge debate between Ethiopia and Yemen. Where does coffee come from? And depending on which side of the Red Sea you live on, you'll have a different answer. I think I'm probably the only Yemeni who thinks coffee starts in Ethiopia. Luckily, there's not many Yemenis in Hawaii. I'm in a safe space.
In Ethiopia, coffee finds its origin. Coffee grows there, and it grows in sort of remarkable places in Ethiopia. And we can talk a little bit about that later, because Mukhtar knows so much about it, and there's some profound stuff. But if coffee has its origin in Ethiopia, it finds its soul in the Yemen. Because somehow between 900, 1300, I think, coffee makes this journey across the Red Sea, across what is known now as the Gulf of Aden, to the Yemen. And coffee begins to grow there. And we don't hear a lot about it until the coffee itself becomes part of the local history and the local culture. And the people who make it part of the local history and local culture aren't farmers, but they're people of spirituality. They're the Sufis, the mystics who live in the mountains in that part of Yemen. And it is said that amongst the mystics, the spiritual masters find that in this unique red bean, they find a certain transformative quality. When they chew it, and first they chew it raw, the red bean of coffee, they chew raw, extracting all the juices and the flavors and the intense caffeine. And that intensity of caffeine, they find in it a sense of sprightliness, awareness. So now not only are they experiencing a physical, they feel they're experiencing something spiritual, because now, as mystics, they can stay up late at night for the nightly devotions. That when others are asleep, the mystics stay up at night and pray and remember God, are together with their beloved, the divine. And so it is in these Sufi orders, in these mystical traditions, that coffee now begins to become, right at its inception, a beverage that is brewed for the purposes of spiritual elation and community. And initially, Mukhtar, isn't it that when coffee starts to be brewed, it's not the bean that's brewed, but it's the coffee fruit itself, what we would term the pisha.
So, the history of coffee is a difficult one to figure out because you have to speak Amharic and Arabic and Turkish and Indonesian, and you have to speak Dutch and all these different languages that talk about the history of coffee. So when I first got into coffee, my background wasn't, I didn't drink coffee 6 years ago really. It's kind of funny me saying that out loud now, even though it's because it's my life now. But I didn't. The coffee that I knew was coffee that was bitter, where you had to put loads of cream and sugar just to make it drinkable. And usually you drank that for studying late night for exams or driving really late. And it wasn't until one day I had a cup of coffee, my godshot was an Ethiopian natural from Yirgacheffe, Ebe Galana. I remember I walked into a coffee shop and I had this cup of coffee and it was $5, which I thought at the time was really expensive for coffee. So I had this cup of coffee and I drank it reluctantly. And I remember tasting blueberries and the sweet, lingering aftertaste, and it was a silky smooth body, and I didn't know coffee could taste that way. And so that was my introduction to this world. And so after that, I began to research coffee, and I was really taken aback about the history of coffee, particularly Yemen's parole. Raise your hand if you or your family immigrated to this country. Right, great. So you can relate. Sometimes growing up as an immigrant, you feel kind of stuck between two worlds. Sometimes you don't feel like you're part of any. And so coffee was this thing that I felt could bridge between my Yemeni side and my American side. Growing up in the Bay Area in San Francisco, it's hard not to be someone who cares about social justice and someone who's a foodie. As soon as I got into coffee, I started to read these Arabic books, and I found out, and coffee begins in Ethiopia somehow, and they would consume it by chewing the cherries. For those who don't know coffee, well, you guys should know because you grow coffee here. Most people don't grow coffee in there, but it's a cherry, and in this cherry there are these layers, and in the layers there's a seed, and that seed is the bean that we roast and drink, and it makes this wonderful drink that will change your life. And so, in Yemen was the first place to begin cultivating coffee intentionally. I always say that coffee begins in Ethiopia, but the first cup was poured in Yemen. And for those who don't know, there's actually a city, a port called Mokha in Yemen. And that's where the name comes from. And so I started seeing these historical references. Mocha, Arabica, this species of coffee that represents 74% of the world's production comes from Yemen. And so the first consumption of coffee, they would actually, it wasn't just the cascar, the outer shell, they would roast the whole bean.
Oh, as is.
The whole dry cherry,
oh, wow.
with the parchment, with the silver skin, with the bean. And they would grind that and make this drink out of it. And so as I started to read, I learned more and more, and I realized I didn't know why people didn't know about this history of coffee. It seems so interesting to me. Then it all comes around this one figure, this man. I'm not the Monk of Mokha, FYI. That title belongs to...
He's my Monk of Mokha.
You're gonna make me blush. And it's very hard for a brown man to blush. So Sheikh Ali ibn Umar al-Aidarus al-Shadili, this man who lives in Mokha, who actually married, his wife was from Harab, from Ethiopia, which I learned way later down the road.
That's deep.
And we'll get to that connection. And so he begins consumption of coffee to his followers. Coffee became the spiritual stimulant. And there's a book titled Inas al-Safa bi Anfas al-Qahwa, the people of Safa, of self-purification through the breaths of coffee. And I'm going to recite these lines just so you can understand how coffee was viewed. These 4 lines that say, "O coffee, O people of love, you helped me repel away my sleep. You helped me stay awake and worship my Lord while people fell asleep. Don't blame me for my intense love for coffee. It is the drink of the righteous people." And that it is, right? And so I heard those words, and it really struck a chord in me. I felt like, why didn't people know about this history of coffee? And so that was how coffee begins in Yemen. His followers begin drinking coffee, and from there, you can see this is a village. The coffee you're drinking actually is from this area in Yemen, in northwestern Yemen. Some 2,000.
The coffee everyone that
Yeah,
Curb
yeah.
is brewing for us
This
today.
coffee currently, it's going 2,200 to 2,300 meters above sea level, which is it's really, really high for coffee to be grown. We have on the back here, Sean Steinman, who is one of the world's leading experts of coffee, and someone that, you guys should all know and ask. If you in terms of coffee geekdom, he's really up there. And he'll explain to you why elevation plays a big role in flavor in coffee. And so if you look at the way coffee is grown here, this is a village. It's about 820 years old. People here live this way. They build villages on the tops of mountains, kind of for defensive purposes, and to survive, they built these incredible terraces along the sides of the mountains to grow their produce and their coffees. And you see here, those are all coffee trees. And over here, it's pretty incredible. These are these terraces. What happens is half the day you have sunlight on one side of the mountain, and the other half is shade, and the fluctuation creates a unique complexity in the flavor of the coffee. Photosynthesis creates more production. Shade usually gives you more body and sweetness, so it's a great balance. If you look over here, that's actually a village, way up there.
Wow.
I remember the first visit, the first 4 months, I lost almost 40 pounds in Yemen. I mean, I had to drop malaria and tapeworms and other things. That's another story. But it was incredible for me to get to go and see these places. This is me trying to look like a brown Indiana Jones. but the history.
You do pretty good.
The history was really just something remarkable, and how they began looking at coffee as a spiritual stimulant, and how they looked at it as a place where people came home after work, and they had these beautiful gatherings, kind of like right now. And they began to talk about, God, have these night prayers and remembrances in these spaces, and they would pass out coffee like we did today. And eventually, coffee made its way from there to Mecca, and I love the story. If you can share the story of this scene, 1511, where the Khair Bey, the Turkish Wali.
And I think we as Muslims know that no good story is complete without a good fatwa. We say that with irony in a bookshop.
Yeah. Those fatwas are legal Islamic rulings, and sometimes they're weird.
So if we think about it, from the place that Mokhtar has described and will continue to describe in a few moments, coffee now literally descends from the circle of Ali ibn Umar al-Shadili and the Sufi orders into the towns and the villages and the urban society of Yemen. It no longer is merely drunk by scholars or devotees or dervishes, but now people in the town start drinking coffee and recognizing the power of coffee, but also the social power of coffee, because coffee is, from its very beginning, a social beverage. And one of the amazing things about the Yemeni people, and Mukhtar is almost a representative of that, is that they love to travel. It's Yemen is one place in the world where if you start exploring the genealogy of the people who descended from there, we're basically covering the entire planet. And the Yemenis love to trade, and and Yemen, of course, was part of the ancient, even pre-Islamic trade routes. And so, as they begin to travel from Arabia Minor to Arabia Major, from Yemen to the Hijaz in modern-day Arabian Peninsula, Saudi Arabia, as we might say, they take their coffee with them because they can't do without it now. They carry the green beans, they carry the cherries on camelback, on horseback, on their own backs, and wherever they stop, they gather and they brew. All the way the trade routes lead, and one of the first major stops on the trade route is the holy city of Mecca. So let's turn our mind's eye to Mecca, 1511. 1511 Mecca is under the authority of the Mamluk Sultans, whose reign will soon end in Cairo, literally in a few years. And the Mamluk Sultans were famous because they were often called the slave dynasty. They began their roots as people who were enslaved and later on became rulers among themselves. And so in Mamluk Mecca, there was a potentate, the local emir, Khair Bey. And Khair Bey ruled over a city which is a remarkably confusing place. What we know about Mecca in 1511 was that trade caravans would stop. People from pilgrimage would come. But we also know that Mecca in 1511 was probably, and I would say arguably, one of the most cosmopolitan and diverse cities in the world, with people coming from all corners of, at that time, the worlds of Islam to do pilgrimage and to trade and to share with each other. One fateful night after the late evening prayers at the holy sanctuary of the Kaaba, the point of reference for Muslims when they pray, Khair Bey was walking back to his home, his palace, and he smelt something that was pungent and aromatic. And he noticed a small fire in the holy precincts, and he went to investigate and found that there were a group of Yemeni traders who were roasting something over an open fire, and another one of them was pounding it, and another one of them was pouring water on it. And as they were doing this, they were saying prayers to each other. They were saying praise of God and praise of the Prophet Muhammad. And they were probably smiling, and they were laughing, and they were conversing. And Khair Bey was a very, very nervous ruler. And he was like, what is this? What is this? I've never seen this before. I've never smelt this before. Maybe this is something that's intoxicating. Why was Khair Bey so concerned about intoxicants in the city of Mecca? Well, some of the old histories tell us that Mecca had a dirty little secret. It had a problem of speakeasies, taverns. I often find that Muslims find that quite shocking. But there were speakeasies and taverns that would illegally open, literally in walking distance from the Holy Mosque. And alcohol would be brewed and sort of served. And Khair Bey would often find these speakeasies and order his guards to tear them down and to dismantle them because alcohol is prohibited in most of Islamic sacred law. And yet, after a few months, they'd appear again. And this had led to a chagrin amongst the religious people of Mecca that Khair Bey was not a good ruler. So Khair thought, oh my God, this is another alcohol problem. Let's convene the Great Council of State. And that's what he did. He brought the scholars of Mecca together. He brought the local leaders of Mecca together. And in 1511, he gathers a council and he says, we need to determine what this thing is and whether it's permissible or not. And then he was told, oh, Bey, this is something that is called kahwa. And it comes from the Yemen, and it's brewed by the Sufis. And they use it in their rituals and in their devotions. And then he said, well, how do we determine whether it's permissible or not? Let us bring the court physicians. And the court physicians were two Persians who were brought into the court. Now, when you have things like court physicians and court scholars, sycophants, and America today is full of lots of sycophants in Washington, you and I can understand that when the court physician shows up and wants to give the president, the Bey, advice on his health, they're going to give exactly the advice that is required. He's going to give exactly the advice that is required. And so the two physicians apparently brew the coffee, they imbibe the coffee, and then they begin to behave like drunkards. They swoon, and they fall to the ground. And they're like, oh, I can't think clearly anymore. This is clearly an intoxicant. And so all of the noble men of Mecca and the scholars say, oh, prohibition. So the fatwa is passed. Coffee is prohibited in Mecca. And coffee found will be taken and will be destroyed. And of course, the historians of coffee mock this, don't they? They mock it in the Arabic histories of coffee, saying that who are these physicians and who are these sheikhs who take something that God gave us and make it illegal? The interesting thing is that Khair Bey thinks that he's achieved something really profound. So he gets the fatwa written out properly, puts it in a scroll of some sort, gets his messenger and says, off to Cairo with you, to the Sultan. And tell the Sultan in Cairo that we have banned coffee, and this intoxicant will never, ever infect the Ummah, the community of Islam. Well, by the time the parchment makes its way makes its way to the Mamluk Sultan in Cairo, it's immediately discarded. Because little does Khair Bey know, coffee has already arrived in Cairo and has become incredibly popular.
Yeah, there's one of the world's oldest universities, Al-Azhar University in Cairo, Egypt. There's a Yemeni quarter there, and the students began drinking coffee, as many students still do, and it spread really quickly. I was actually talking with James Freeman, the founder of Blue Bottle Coffee, and he mentioned that like in the 15th century there was almost 3,000 coffee houses serving single order Yemeni coffee in Cairo.
In Cairo alone.
Alone, like he said, he goes, what wave was that? And we talk about these third waves, and so it was sad that there were these like this huge dispute between scholars whether coffee was it permissible or not, and people like some people would go to coffee shop and just try to destroy coffee, and you see coffee, rivers of coffee being poured on the ground, and it was a huge debate for quite a bit.
Almost 100 years, on and off. The story of Khair Bey has an interesting but kind of bloody ending, which is that Khair Bey was so useless as a potentate in Mecca that in the dying moments of the Mamluk Sultanate, Khair Bey was called back to Cairo, and he ended up being drawn and quartered. That's not a pirate term. That literally means he was drawn and quartered. He was executed for incompetence. The two physicians were also called back to Cairo to face the threat, but they were killed by highway robbers, their bodies chopped up and thrown into the desert. And the scholar who passed the fatwa also died a very early and untimely death.
Because we had riots actually in the streets for coffee. The people went out demanding their right to coffee.
In 1521, during the holy month of Ramadan, there was this dispute around whether coffee was legal or not, and one scholar came out and said it wasn't. And so coffee was initially destroyed, but within weeks, the Yemeni trade caravans came and coffee was established again. And then in 1532 again, a local police chief, I think, tried to ban coffee.
Part of the reason why was it was seen as something that enticed political disruption, because coffee and coffee houses historically were places where people had social change. You look at when coffee enters Europe, which we will talk about soon, the Russian and French revolutions happened in coffee houses. The Boston Tea Party was planned in a coffee house called the Green Dragon. And so they were always wary of places where people did that. They were fine with alcohol because people got drunk, but they were afraid of the intellectual power of coffee. And then eventually a man named Abdul-Qadir al-Jaziri, this Muslim scholar from Iraq originally, he writes an incredible defense for coffee.
In 1587.
1587. And this work is actually considered the oldest manuscript in the world that talks about coffee that's still around, and it's in the National Library in Paris.
Mokhtar has seen and looked upon the original.
Ever since I found out about this manuscript, it took me 2 years to try to see it, but they had it in this. You had to be a researcher and have a special card, and so eventually this journalist reached out to me and said, I can get you. I have a research card. I can have you go to look at it. And it's in the National Library in Paris, and all I knew was that it was under under this like thing called Erebe 1590. This like catalog in this like somewhere.
Like a folio of some sort.
Yeah, and so they go in the back and they pull it out and it's in a microfiche, and I'm going through and it's like several books are in this microfiche, hundreds of pages, and it's like the first book is about hellfire and the second book is about, and I'm looking through it, and finally this book comes out and it's titled The Pillars of Self-Purification in Defense of Coffee. And some of the lines in that are really powerful. Coffee, there was one that you liked, which was the one?
That coffee is the common person's gold, and it brings to every person who imbibes it nobility.
There was one that when coffee is served, there is grace and splendor and friendship and happiness. So it's 7 parts. The first chapters are like, what is coffee, where does it start, how it began in Yemen, and then it talks about how do we find jurisprudence in Islamic law, and the last chapter is these beautiful poems about coffee, and it's just wonderful to see that coffee was looked at, this really wonderful beverage.
Well, it's not only Cairo, is it, where coffee now finds a home. Damascus, Aleppo, Baghdad, Mosul, the great cities of the Islamic world, each and every one of them become home to coffee and coffee houses. And at this time, I think what's fascinating economically is as the Ottoman Empire begins to rise and the Mamluk dynasty in Egypt is replaced by the Ottomans, and in fact, Ottoman Empire comes to control even the Yemen, they now have a monopoly on this amazing new cash crop. It's fascinating because, as Mokhtar rightfully said just a few moments ago, if we think back to where all the coffee in this region was coming from, it's single origin, organically grown, coffee. That means the quality of coffee in Hala, you're drinking it right now, circa 1600. The quality of coffee must have been remarkable. And coffee houses started spreading everywhere. But this wasn't just an Arabian world phenomenon. This was a phenomenon that literally began to spread throughout the world. And this is where we get into a little bit of intrigue. Because the Ottomans had a rule. You couldn't steal live coffee plants and couldn't take live coffee plants out of the Yemen on punishment of death.
Yeah, they had this strict rule, the Yemeni imams and the Ottomans, where they only sold beans that were baked or boiled, so that the embryo in the bean would die and you couldn't grow it again.
Think about the sophistication of that. When Mokhtar told me that level, it's like, this is gold. This is more precious than gold. And yet, people are coming from all over the world to the Yemen, and one of these sorry souls was a man by the name who has come to be known as Baba Budan. Baba Budan was a dervish, a Sufi from India who had found himself in the Yemen to study Islam and to be with his spiritual fraternity. And when he had to go back to India, he was crestfallen. He says, how can I live without coffee now? And so he decided to break the law. And it's said that he took 7 live beans and he taped them to his chest and put his Sufi dervish cloak around it, said lots and lots of prayers, and traveled to South India, where indeed, up until today, the shrine of Baba Budan is a place you go visit, you pray, and then you sit outside and you drink coffee. The coffee that came from the Yemen now finds itself being farmed and grown in India. India becomes one of the first places, actually, where coffee goes. But Mukhtar, it's even more complicated than that, isn't it? Because now we have the Dutch East India Company. And the colonial eye now is on coffee because they're recognizing that it's one hell of a cash crop.
One of my favorite maps.
Oh,
It's pretty accurate for the most part. That especially Coffee Association in America produced this. And so, how does coffee make its way from Yemen to Hawaii, right? No one knew that there was so much coffee in the field, but they kept focusing on Yemen. So the Port of Mokha, this ancient port, becomes this really incredible place of commerce. Every major power had ambassadors that did trade there. And so they began doing heavy trade in the 15 and 1600s particularly. And so they wanted to get seeds out. And it was a very sophisticated trade network. There's a great book called The Merchant Houses of Mokha by Nancy and it really brings to life how sophisticated the trade network was, where all Yemen coffee from all across Yemen was brought to this one city called Beit al-Faqih, where there were a lot of jurists, and it was taxed there. Then from there, they were allowed to bring it to the port. And there was Indian traders and Spanish and the Dutch East India Company, the VOC Company, which historically is known for most of the West Atlantic slave trade happening through this one company. Just to give you a background of who they are, they were able to send spies, and the story goes that they were able to take seeds out from Yemen and begin growing them in one of their colonies in Indonesia on the island of Java. That's where the name Java comes from. So mocha, we hear the term a lot, with this chocolate coffee kind of flavor, drink. When coffee began being grown in other countries, they wanted to imitate this mocha. You notice some of our coffees have like a fruit but a chocolate flavor to it. They wanted to imitate the taste that came from mocha, from Yemen. So they began putting chocolate into their coffee drinks, hence mocha. So Mocha and Java became these two places that first began growing coffee. And going back to the word coffee, qahwa, that's how we pronounce it in Arabic. In the Turkish language, they can't say the Arabic letter wow. So instead of wali, they say veli. So qahwa became kahve, which is still the way they pronounce it. The Dutch took that and they spelled coffee Koffie, gave it that term coffee. And then in 1582, it enters the English language as coffee or coffee if you're from Brooklyn.
And so, as Mukhtar pointed out, we begin to start seeing the way coffee goes to India, and then through Ceylon to Java, and then how it spreads. And in fact, how by the 1700s, they're trying to grow coffee in Europe, in the botanical gardens of Paris and Amsterdam even. But the story would not be complete if we didn't turn our attention to Constantinople and to Istanbul. If Ethiopia is where coffee had its divine origins, if Yemen is where coffee found its soul, then it was in Constantinople that coffee became an art form. The fabled coffee houses of Istanbul were something that, if you and I can imagine in our minds, would have been something remarkable. The old Ottoman manuscripts show pictures of coffee houses. In one corner there's a musician that's playing, in another corner a storyteller. At the back of the coffee house, the pious scholars read their holy books, and in the front of the coffee shop, backgammon is being played, or chess. And then there's a special corner for Mukhtar's coffee ancestors. The corner where the Kavechi Basha sits. And the Kavechi Basha literally means the Pasha of coffee, the master of coffee. And the Kavechi Basha becomes such an important part of society, and the coffee houses are, I would argue, one of the most disruptive social inventions of human history. Why? Before the coffee house, what are the places where people gather? They either gather in the mosque, they gather in the madrasa, the school, they gather in the markaz, or the souk, or where the shops are, or they gather in the maidan in their homes, the diwan, your living room. Places of social, there are no restaurants. Taverns are broadly illegal, or very, very quiet. Where do people actually gather for social discourse? Those are probably all the places. And then comes this thing called the kahvehane, the coffee house, the house of coffee. And it becomes, the Ottomans say, the coffee house is an extension of my living room. It's like you take that private space and it's now public. And for the first time, the religious authorities, the political authorities, the commercial authorities don't have control over how you talk and who you talk with. The coffee house becomes a disruptive social space. And the Kavechi Basha, the one who is taking the single origin organic Yemeni beans, which are arriving in the ports of Constantinople, they are now brewing it, and now they're inventing. They're grinding in a different way. They're brewing, they're tasting, they're offering. The Kavechi Basha becomes so important in Ottoman structures that some of them become viziers or ministers in the Ottoman government. The Sultan himself has his own Kavechi Basha. The Ottoman armies, the Janissaries, carry Kavechi Bashas in each division, so that wherever they stop, coffee is brewed. Coffee becomes part of the soul of Ottoman culture. And coffee houses also themselves start to take on beautiful appearances. There's a French traveler in the Ottoman Levant who has an amazing commentary, and he comes from France, and he's in Aleppo or Mosul, and also great Ottoman cities. And he writes that, he goes, I've seen something I've never seen before. I've seen the rich and the poor sitting in the same space, drinking the same beverage. He says, I've never seen this happen where we're from, where the high and the low meet in these public spaces. Coffee in these spaces becomes something deeply powerful and also dangerous, because there is the famous story of one of the Ottoman Sultans, Murad the Grim, adequately noted, who would dress as a commoner and go through the coffee houses and find that people were talking sedition, criticizing his government. So he bans coffee for a short period of time and says that if you are found with coffee, you will be beaten. And if you are found with coffee again, we'll put you in a sack and we'll sink you in the Bosphorus. Sadly, sadly for Murad the Grim, he dies very quickly afterwards. This is again God's plan to punish those who try to deny us coffee. And coffee becomes, again, an important crop. So, in the words of an American scholar of coffee houses and coffee history, who says the coffee house was in birth and development a decidedly Muslim institution. Starbucks, I'm awaiting our reparations to all Muslim communities for popularizing coffee houses.
It's one of my favorite parts of your presentation. When I first heard, he has an incredible radio program, the BBC, called the Muhammadan Bean, Secretive History of Coffee. And I remember when I first heard it, I couldn't stop listening. I've heard like 45, 60 times, I don't know, but this part of like how revolutionary coffee houses were, because even when they did go to Europe, they became a place where the first time there were no social barriers, class barriers between people, and that frightened a lot of people. And this next story that I think also it's interesting to see the interaction of coffee, the East and West, when it first went into Europe. So Pope Clement VIII in the 1600s, he bans coffee. He actually he calls it an evil Muhammadan drink. He implements a Muslim ban, in a sense, like someone we know will. And the people wanted this, so the merchants, they were able to allow him to try some. They persuaded him, and he finally reluctantly had some coffee. And after his first few sips, he fell in love with the bean so much that he actually baptized the beans. Do you remember what he said, one of the things he said about the bean?
The devil's drink is so delicious, we should cheat the devil by baptizing him. Because actually encoded in a lot of that Christian Muslim engagement was this idea that wine was a divine beverage, and that coffee, because it was black and sooty, was the beverage of the devil. And in fact, we're going to see this trope appear again, because this trope appears a lot. Christ's beverage and Muhammad's beverage. God's beverage and the devil's beverage. There's a real, there's an interesting narrative about coffee, which even continues.
Devil's cake and...
Yeah, exactly. And now we know that one of the great cafes of Europe are established in Vienna, but we also know that coffee starts making its way into places like Venice because of trade. But it's in Europe that we have a really interesting set of sort of political, military, and social experiments going on, because we know that there were coffee houses in Vienna even before the siege of the Ottomans of Vienna. But there's this great story. And what was the coffee house called?
So this is one of my the thing that when Dave first wanted to write this book about my work, I didn't know what he would write about, and so I was really reluctant. But it's really beautiful to see some of the symmetries, that the way history repeats itself. It's pretty incredible, and this was one of my favorite stories. In 1683, the Ottoman army besieges Vienna, and it is arguably one of the most important battles in history. And they besieged Vienna, and so a man named George Franz Kolchitsky was able to go through Turkish lines. He had lived in Istanbul, so he spoke a little bit of Turkish. And so he sent word to Polish troops to bring reinforcements.
And he himself was Polish.
Yeah, they had over 300 troops that had besieged the whole city. And it was they would say the last stronghold for Europe before, it was the furthest Ottoman expansion in that time period. And so eventually they were able to repel the Turkish army, Ottoman army, and they left behind lots of things. From those, I believe there were 500 sacks of these strange beans that the Viennese thought it was just camel food or horse food. They didn't know what it was. But Franz knew what they were. He knew they were coffee beans because he had been to Istanbul. And so they were gifted to him by the king, and he opened one of the first coffee houses in Central Europe, and he called this coffee house. Anyone know? Raise your hand if you know.
Blue Bottle.
The Blue Bottle. And so 332 years later, when I would make my journey out of Yemen, I would find a home for these same beans that came from Mocha in the same coffee house, but in California.
At Blue Bottle Coffee.
Yeah.
I think that's just amazing. There's like a kind of a divine journey around that. But coffee just doesn't remain in Central Europe. I would say, to continue the analogy, if Ethiopia has coffee's origin, Yemen is where coffee finds its soul, Istanbul is where coffee becomes an art form, I'd say London is where coffee becomes a culture. London at its height had one coffee house for every 140 people. Coffee predates tea. Coffee was more popular than alcohol. Coffee was part and parcel of what London was. And in 1652, a very mysterious, strange man, some people say of Cypriot origin, others say Italian origin, Pasquale Rosé, the manservant to a British merchant living in Ottoman Greece at the time, moves back to London. And they both, manservant and employer, are obsessed with coffee. They love Ottoman coffee. And they're like, we can't live without this. And Pasquale Rosé, the manservant, says, look, you fund the business, I'll take care of selling it. I got a plan. So on a little alley off the Cornhill, which you can still visit today, and I've visited it, I've touched the walls and the ground, Pasquale Rosé sets up not a coffee shop, but a coffee shack. He dresses like a Turk with a turban, wears his Ottoman robes, brews coffee, sooty, poorly made, gruely kind of coffee, and serves it not in cups, but in tin plates, handing them out to the businessmen along the Cornhill, to the merchants. Please have some of this beverage. Have some of this beverage. And they drink it, and they're obsessed. Within a few years, these shacks become coffee houses. And these coffee houses charge a penny, not for every cup of coffee, a penny just to come in and you can have all the coffee you want. An active trade starts of coffee beans that begin to come into the city of London. This picture I love, and I don't know how well you can see it, but I just want you to imagine, this is literally like a few hundred meters, right, Mokhtar? Like right off the Cornhill. Farina and I in London live sort of over here. So this is very much our neighborhood. It's about a 15-minute walk from our front door. This is the Cornhill. This is where the Bank of England is. The very heart of the old city of London. A lot of which was destroyed in the Fire of London and rebuilt again. Each one of these circles represents a coffee house. This is literally within 100 square meters, and there are coffee houses dedicated to every manner of pursuit. And this is when I say this is where coffee became a culture, it means that each coffee house now became a place of particular cultural output. There were some coffee houses where to get in, it wasn't a payment in cash. To get in, you had to bring a new piece of news. So you would walk in, and everyone in the coffee house would say, "What say ye?" Said, "Oh, I just heard. Just heard Asad Jaffrey got a new bicycle." Says, "Oh, that's old news. Charles over there told us. Bring us something else." There were coffee houses where you couldn't enter a coffee house until you offered a couplet of poetry. There were coffee houses where only members of parliament went. Samuel Johnson, in his diaries, speaks about how he once gave a terrible speech in Parliament that lasted 3 hours. And after he left this Parliament, he's like, I better get to the coffee house and do my advanced PR, do my fake news about it before word travels. And it said that by the time he'd walked into the coffee house, about 150 meters from Westminster, everyone laughed at him. And the diarist Samuel Pepys talks about wandering the streets of London, and that a lot of these personalities actually had routes. They would begin their day by visiting one coffee shop and then go to another. And this is how they were carrying it. Lloyd's of London started as a coffee house.
It's pretty, one of my favorite parts of coffee in the history is this time period. And like Abdul-Rehman mentioned, there were certain coffee houses that were known for philosophers and some for musicians. And they became places of incredible human creativity and growth. But for some there's a lot of dark side of coffee too, and
Yeah.
I'm gonna spill a lot of beans tonight, so don't today. There's a lot of things, a lot of puns. Don't worry. But for whatever reason, in London, brothels become infamous with coffee houses.
Yeah.
So much so that actually men would use coffee as an excuse for why they wouldn't want to have intimacy with their wives, sleep with their wives. And so women were so fed up with coffee that they actually formed a petition, the Women's Petition Against Coffee of 1674.
Because this is also a politically sensitive time.
Very, very much between East, quote unquote, East and West. And so King Charles II, I believe, he bans coffee. And I think it lasted for like 2 weeks before the people rioted and they, legalized it again. But it's also interesting for me that this time period, how coffee was, and I hope that coffee houses should be these places of human thought and growth and social movements.
And there was a rule in a coffee house that in a coffee house there was no such thing as a private conversation. That you would walk in a coffee house, and if I found the two of you talking, I could just sit down and say, "What's going on?" And it would have been totally acceptable. It would have been totally acceptable because the coffee houses was this, as Habermas calls it, the philosopher. It was the first truly democratic public space. And of course, we know now that it wasn't as democratic as we would have liked it to be. Women were not admitted to most coffee houses, and those who were often those who were people of the night, so to speak. We also know that eventually what brought the downfall of the coffee house was class and evil tea, because the British East India Company couldn't control coffee, but they could control tea. And so the 4 o'clock tea time gets instituted in places like India, and a taste and a market is formed around tea, which of course has been part of Asian culture for a long time, but it's very new, very, very new to the West.
And coffee, because of the Boston Tea Party, coffee becomes a very patriotic drink here in America against British colonial rule. So that's another part of that history. And then it's for me, like, I wanted to bring something about some kind of connection through Yemen with Hawaii, and I think Sean would be much more, if you don't mind, speaking a little bit about Yemen varietal mocha and its significance in Hawaii and Kona coffee, or coffee here.
Please.
If you don't mind, please.
Just a few words, because we'd love to hear about how this Yemeni coffee essentially makes its way to the middle of the Pacific Ocean.
Okay. In the 1980s, coffee was being resurgent in Hawaii. It had only been in Kona for about 80, 90 years, and sugarcane and pineapple were tanking, and coffee was the crop that was going to be a great diversifying crop and be great for all these companies that had all these acres of land. And in the process of figuring out what to do, they worked at the university and they did these variety trials. They planted coffee all around the state, and they tasted it, and they grew it, trying to find coffee that would work at these other locations, but also coffee that would be good for mechanically harvesting. And there's this variety from Yemen that nobody in the world grew, called mocha, spelled with 2 Ks. And it's a weird tree. It's super dwarf. The leaves are really tiny and thin. The cherries are super tiny. You'd never want to pick it by hand. It's such a pain. And the seeds are all very tiny and round.
Yemenis are pretty tiny in general.
So as it turned out, this farm on Maui thought this was great. It tasted good here. It works well. And so they grow this variety mocha. And for a long time, they're the only place for 10, 15, 20 years that was growing this Yemeni variety. It tastes great. It's adorable. There's a couple places around the world that grow it now, but very few. And when it became clear coffee was really going to make a resurgence, the Hawaii Agricultural Research Center said, "Hey, this is a great tasting variety, but it's so small, it's a pain in the ass. We should find a way to capture its greatness and get rid of its junk parts." So they started a breeding program to come up with a few truly Hawaiian varieties. And they use this variety to breed with other varieties over here to create Hawaiian varieties. And some of these varieties are outplanted in farms right now, not very many. The most famous of which is this one that's grown in Kona right now on a farm, on Greenwell Farm. It's called Moma. And it's a really spectacular variety, and it has this strong parentage coming from Yemen.
I love that only coffee people can use the word adorable to describe coffee.
Sometimes celestial, I've heard celestial. But no, it's pretty incredible, like to think about. And for us in Yemen, a place where there's so much genetic diversity. You know, I think there's less than 1.3% of diversity outside of Yemen and Ethiopia in the coffee world. Coffee is only grown in these countries between tropics of Cancer and Capricorn for the most part. And one of our work, you know, we hope to do is finding people like Sean who can help us figure out candidate varietals that can maybe be grown in countries that want, you know, unique flavors, or countries that are devastated because certain diseases are now prevalent because of climate change, like leaf rust, and we have trees that are resistant towards that. But yeah, and I thought that was so incredible, like to have like, you know, a Yemen varietal, and there's a few countries that you see the mocha varietal, you know, being mixed, the SL20 varietal in Kenya and a few others like that. But yeah.
And literally the DNA of the Yemen. And I would say with that, because I'm a sort of believing sort of guy, I believe that DNA also carries a spiritual DNA. There's something in the stuff of coffee that carries with it. One final London story before we wrap up, and I want to show a great picture of you in a second. That's my favorite. I want to show my favorite picture of Mukhtar. You know, in London, because you know, a lot of people didn't have access to education, particularly amongst the London Jewish community in the 1800s, where often formal education was denied to them because of stark and rabid anti-Semitism. Coffee houses became known as penny universities. They literally became places of learning and knowledge where philosophers, scholars, linguists would gather all day over cups of coffee, and students would come and learn from them. Some of the greatest Jewish thinkers and philosophers of the late 19th and 20th century say that they were educated in coffee houses, more important than the Oxfords and Cambridges that they eventually went to. So because these were places of profound learning, and they were places of profound gathering. There's so much to be said about this, and there's so much to talk about. It's almost inexhaustible. I love this picture. It's from British Mandate Palestine, and it shows coffee in the way it was probably brewed in the confines of the sacred mosque in 1511, as it was brewed in the coffee houses, as it was brewed in the narrow streets of the Al-Azhar in Cairo. Someone is pounding, someone is roasting, someone is serving, and everyone's just sitting and talking and being with each other. And that's why I love this picture. This is a powerful picture for me. And I actually cried when Mokhtar told me the story of this picture, because it's this picture, and you can speak to it in a moment, says something about the transformative power of coffee today, this moment, and the work that this man is doing with the Port of Mokha by bringing coffee back to the place from whence it came, and to give it life again is remarkable. So tell us about this beautiful picture, because it's a pretty incredible story.
Thank you for that previous picture. I'm a little out of words because you know, I started this journey and I didn't know much about coffee, and I grew up, you know, very poor in SF, in the Tenderloin district, which is not a very tender place at all. Oldest of 7 children, and I had this idea of doing something, and I never thought I'd see myself in this place with people like you today, but I'm really honored to be on this journey. And this picture, when I first started working in Yemen, I noticed that the further away from the farmer, the more money there was. And all these people in between. And one of the things I really, really strongly believe in is the power of direct trade, and the power of us as consumers being conscious of how we buy things. That even with coffee, that we have the power to really uplift people just by understanding where it comes from and how the people are treated. We also get a better tasting product too. And so as I kept going, you know, the further away from the farmers, there was just these middle people and this cycle of debt. Farmers were being taken advantage of by loan sharks who gave out predatory loans. And so I began working with these farmers, these small communities in one village in particular. And this picture here, I learned early on that most farmers had never tasted their coffee. And that might sound shocking, but a lot of producers of things like cacao in West Africa, most of them don't know what chocolate tastes like. They make this, they slave and they work there so hard to produce something but it's taken to another facility, a city, and it's processed there, and then it's exported to another country, like in the West, where the final product is made in this beautiful way we drink it today. And so when I found out, I was really saddened. I learned that only 15% of beans in Yemen are consumed domestically. And I was working with this community for almost 2 months, and I realized they had never tasted their coffee one day. And I was really taken back, because just 2 hours away in the capital, I had a roaster, and I could roast and drink coffee there. And so I went and I got some coffee from them. And in this picture, I really wanted to understand why it's important to pick red cherries, why their coffees are unique. And so I had their coffee, a Sumatran and an Ethiopian coffee. And I had a blind tasting. I didn't even tell them their coffee was on the table. But I asked them, this is how we grade coffee, this is you slurp it. And I went through the process of teaching them that. And it's very important that when working with people who've been working in this really ancient art, not to come arrogantly and try to teach them something, because the older generation actually knew much more than I did. It just wasn't passed down to my generation. And so to come and find proverbs and find things from the way they would pick coffee, like you're supposed to pick it, these lines of poetry, like when it's red, like the red cherry, or the carnelian stone I have on. And so afterwards I asked them, which one do you like the most? And they all picked their coffee. Every single one of them. So when I lifted the cups and they saw the names and they saw their coffee, they were so just happy and proud, and you could see the look on their faces, especially the guy in the middle, who was really excited. And the guy on the right, his father, the whole time I felt he was so annoyed by me. This young guy, what are you doing? Why you slurp with a spoon? He was actually the best taster that day. He was really interested in how he picked up on very interesting hints. But it was really, really important for me for them to know how coffee is tasted and how it's consumed. As it's important for me to tell you how the coffee is produced and that journey it takes. That's why I really care a lot about baristas. They're the last people who engage with us along this wonderful journey.
How much did their coffee sell for before you got involved?
Their coffees, they were in a vicious cycle of debt. They didn't make any money, really. They were always every year in debt.
How many dollars a pound, maybe?
Their coffee at the time, they were paying 35% less than we were paying them. And so per pound, they were paying, I think, $5. They were paying this year. It was probably $2.20 a pound for their coffee.
$2.20.
For dry cherries, which is very expensive for most countries. Yemen is an anomaly.
And what did the highest price per pound of your coffee go for this past year?
Theirs went ended up going for that same year $6.25. So you're looking at 3 times more than what they're being made. And for us, it might not seem like a lot. For them, it's life changing completely. Their lives are just totally different now. Initially they were the ones that being subsidized, their families in the cities who helped them. And now it's really the reverse effect, because of the war that's going on now. Many farmers, their families have left the cities, and now they're going back to working coffee trees.
I want to thank Abdul-Rehman and Mokhtar for being here with us. Can we give them a round of applause, please? Just a couple of housekeeping notes. We do have till 1 o'clock in the space, but we want you guys to be able to check out the book itself. It's a great story. Please do buy the book. We have probably enough for just about everybody. There's another event here at 2:30 that's open to the public. Abdul-Rehman and Mokhtar will both be here. They might do an impromptu talk about the book itself. So tell your friends who weren't able to make it, tell them to come back. I believe there'll be coffee for sale at that as well to drink. Make sure you check that out. You're free to kind of get up, peruse now. If anybody does have some questions, which you may have, we're also kind of open to taking those now at this point. So it's kind of up to you. There's free time for about the next 20 minutes.
And this afternoon at we'll try around 3 o'clock.
Right.
To maybe have an impromptu book talk and speak about the journey that Mokhtar took with Dave Eggers and what the last sort of 3 or 4 years has looked like in terms of his story. So even you're more than welcome to come back then. But go ahead.
Oh, this is just a little postscript that they were growing coffee in Manoa in the 19th century.
Wow.
They brought it in from South America, and I don't know what kind it was, but a Hawaiian chief called, I think his name was Boki, teamed up with I guess someone from the mainland, United States, and you could still find some of these coffee trees way back in the forest preserve system in Manoa. So they would have probably no connection with Kona coffee,
Right.
but it's interesting that they were trying to grow it in the 19th century.
That's really interesting. Thank you. Go ahead, sir.
I kind of have two questions. When did sugar get introduced, and why did, like, Turkish coffee now is so sweet? You know, it's like that super strong and sweet. Was sugar always kind of associated, or what did that?
It's a good question, Mokhtar.
You know, initially, because the way coffee was picked, they picked it when it was really ripe and red, and you know, it was all hand picked. So the coffees, like this coffee itself, I always tell people try it without sugar first, and they always take it back like it tastes really sweet. There's no bitterness, so they didn't really have to put much sugar. As coffee, you know, went on and to other places, people added certain things. So now in Yemen, they put a lot of sugar and spices and cardamom into it. Coffee, the blue bottle in Europe, in Vienna, when it first opened up, it wasn't popular. So the way they made it popular was they started experimenting with milks and cream, and then they had that whole part of history. So as coffee entered different places, they added different things, and so we had different modes. But I think it was in Vienna where a lot of cream started to enter.
And I also think that as cash crops grow, and as there's intersection between the way these large colonial companies had lots of different interests, coffee, sugar, tea, a lot of it was, how do you create added markets? So we add one thing to the other so that there's a market for sugar and there's a market for coffee. There's a market for tea, there's a market for coffee. And I think that I think Mokhtar sort of referred to it, there's a dark side to coffee. I mean, when we think about coffee in a place like Brazil, which is the largest grower of coffee in the world today, the initial plantations in places like Hispaniola, the island of Hispaniola, in Brazil, would have been based on indentured or even slave trade. So there's a kind of a dark side of any kind of global beverage or global cash crop that emerges, and there is a kind of a dark side to the way in which coffee, particularly during that period, during the periods of colonization and the growth of the Western capitalist system, really, that coffee takes on this kind of very dark story, and the abuse. I mean, you talked about the abuse of the farmers in Yemen, in places like Ethiopia, before the fair trade movement. I mean, the kind of to the bottom auctioning that would happen around coffee and the way global multinationals would produce it was devastating. And when Mokhtar tells me stories about how, you know, in these communities, for the first time they're building schools and public toilets and they're able to pay for the marriages of their kids, I mean, it's revolutionary what direct trade is doing. And in that way, we make a lot of fun of the kind of the hipster coffee movements, and I know there's a lot there that we can get kind of down on. But thank God for not just fair trade, but direct trade and the relationship that these coffee houses and roasters are creating with farmers, because it is transformative.
Sean mentioned it earlier too. The companies, they want to know how to make more profit. That's like their goal. So they will actually promote profit over taste. And so for them, like, okay, if I can create a Robusta, if I can create a varietal species of coffee or a hybrid that can output more coffee, we would make much more profit, and then people can always add, you know, sugar. That's the truth of it.
Absolutely, there's a
We had another.
yeah.
No, I was curious, how did in Yemen people stop drinking coffee? How did that happen?
Then I say they stopped. I mean, they always did, but I think the traders early on realized how big of a demand the world coffee supply demand was. So coffee was always exported out, and so locally in Yemen, what they drank even till today mostly is the kaskar, the outer husk. It's brewed as a tea, and it's really delicious. And I think it's a lot of people. There's recent articles about kaskar now. It's this next big wave. It's super incredible. It has a lot of antioxidants, more than cranberries, and it's really delicious. And so Yemenis have this wonderful tea that we make with this kashkar. We call it gishir. We use cardamom and ginger and saffron sometimes, and it's very similar to chai.
You should introduce it in Bay Area with your coffee.
Oh, Port of
another
Mokha is going to be carrying Cascara
Cascara, yeah.
very, very
We have
soon.
some cool
Have you already introduced it yet? Or
we have some really interesting things we're working on bringing in because ours also is dried process. The cascara is very sweet, has more sugar, but yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
First, thank you so much. This
You're
is
welcome.
super fascinating. I was trying to take all those notes, but I was really captivated by the history of like the Sufis, the spirituality behind part of the drink, and because I am a tea lover, I'm actually really buzzing off of that little cup right now. But I kind of am wondering where that association is with coffee today. Like tea, it started, but tea is still quite represented by spiritual, a very Zen thing. Yoga studios are kind of serving it along with tea. So like, where is that with coffee?
I think
That's
also
a really good question.
I think our coffee is because the higher coffee is grown, the less caffeine there is. Caffeine is a chemical that's produced to help fight off like insects. So our coffees usually have half the caffeine in most coffees. Arabica has half, as Robusta. A lot of bigger chains of coffees have a lot of species of varietals that have a lot of caffeine and kind of gives you really kind of too wired. I think that, I mean, in a way, coffee lost a lot of its spirituality as capitalism took over and it became something to make money out of. It was a cash crop. Honestly, like, one of my goals for coffee houses and coffee shops is I would like to see them as places of human people getting together and being gathered. You know, you see, you know, like, and it's moving away from that. Sometimes you go to a lot of these hipster coffee shops, there's no Wi-Fi. They make the chairs in a way where you can't sit there for too long, like it's not comfortable. But you look at, you know, back in, you know, not that long ago, like, you know, Friends or whatever, you know, Central Perk, you know, or they had, the coffee house was a place where everyone got together and hung out. So I hope that can happen, that kind of third space can be brought in again.
I think I totally with Mokhtar on that, and I think for me the kind of what Mokhtar did for us today as he was talking and brewing and serving, there's something about coffee and social connection. It's sort of in the way that coffee is, and I think it's true. I think different beverages have different qualities, and there's something, you know, when Asad brews tea, for me I feel very calm because he of course has the DJ fingers. Some of you witnessed last night. I mean, he's pouring and unpouring and first flush and second flush, and you sit and you drink and you taste, and it's, you know, and I think there's something about the ritual of that, and I think part of the ritual of coffee is energy and the energy that comes from connection. You know, coffee is something where you want to cradle it, and as Mokhtar was saying earlier, as it cools, it becomes tastier, so you gotta let it cool, and that takes time. One of my favorite coffee stories that I heard recently, and my friend Tika is here from Indonesia, and we worked together on a project for the last 2 years called the Cafe Cerita, the Cafe of Stories, which was about transforming people through engagement in coffee houses and storytelling. But one of the most beautiful stories I heard in Indonesia was in the city of Solo in central Java, where we had a Lutheran street pastor who, you know, there'd been violence against Christian communities in this particular city, and he left the church, the confines of the church, and he became someone who began to say that he wanted to sort of meet and interact with those people who were most critical of his own faith tradition, and he found a local group who had a very kind of a jarring name and who were calling for the elimination of Christianity in Indonesia and so on, and after many months of trying, he was a lover of coffee, and he found out that the leader of this sort of extremist movement was also a lover of coffee. So finally, after months of trying, he got into that same space with that leader. He says, "All I want is one cup of coffee with you." He said, "That's all I want. I just want a cup of coffee." So finally, you know, they got together in a coffee house, and in Indonesia, they serve the coffee hot, like really hot. And so you gotta sip it real slow. And so they got, you know, kopi tubruk, the very gruely coffee where all the sediment needs to settle and it cool. They had a tubruk coffee between them. And he was telling us the story, this Lutheran pastor. He told us that the first thing that the leader of this sort of extremist, quote-unquote, Islamic organization told him was, he says, "I just want you to know before we start talking that I don't think you belong in Indonesia, and that if I had a chance, I'd kill you." And the pastor said that he kind of laughed. He says, "Okay, well," he says, "it's lucky that's not going to happen today." And you know, over 10 years, he said, they had coffee regularly. And he said each coffee meeting was well over an hour because the coffee was so hot. And they would hold it and they would sip it. And he said the most remarkable thing happened after the Aceh tsunami is that this organization had a relief wing which had gone to Aceh, the Lutherans had a relief wing, and they were all working together in Aceh, delivering relief to the people of Aceh who'd been affected by the tsunami. And he said it was at a public gathering where all the heads of the relief organizations came together at the end of their term in Aceh and they were leaving. And this same individual, after 10 years of drinking coffee with this Lutheran pastor, came to the microphone and started crying. And he said that 10 years ago, I said to this man here that his blood was permissible for me to take. And he said, now I'll say that he was one of the blessed unbelievers. And they embraced. And it was so interesting that even though they had their own positionality, it was coffee and just the gathering, just the social, the talking over 10 years. He's written about it in a book, and the diaries that he would, every coffee meeting, there would be diaries that he would write. And I think that's for me the power, is that if we can find those places where we brew together, share something that we love together, talk with each other, and that's what I think coffee encourages us to do in a really profound way.
I want to say thank you to all of you for coming and being with us. Thank you to Emily and Dave from the shop. Thank you to all of the great team that's been serving you from the Curb. Please do visit them. They're just down the street right here in Kaimuki. Thank you to the Shangri staff for helping us. And of course, thank you to our guests, Abdul-Rehman Malik, Mokhtar Alkhanshali, who've come here with us. We have one program that's not sold out within this residency. It's happening tomorrow at Arts and Marks Garage. It's kind of a big space, so we still have space, and that's called Celluloid Soul, an evening of faith in film. It's shorts from the Inside Film Festival that Abdul-Rehman happens to be the director of. So it's about 2 hours of short films. It's from 3 o'clock. You can come. There'll be tickets at the door. And tell your friends.
Lots of great conversation and hopefully some coffee as well.
Make sure to get some books, and another round of applause for
and
these
Mukhtar
guys.
will sign for you.
Yeah, Mukhtar will sign the book. So.
Thank you guys.